Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead. Welcome, everyone. Thank you to everyone who's joining us live, and thank you to everyone who is listening to this after the fact, and people who are listening via the podcast or Vimeo. I'm very happy to welcome our guest today. Our guest is Brittany Goss. She is a fantastic astrologer and coach who is based in Brooklyn. She's also a first degree member of my coven. And her website and horoscopes are found at her site, which is rebelastrology.net. And that is an excellent website, and I can personally attest to and recommend her work. I am Joanna Farrar, and I am the assistant high priestess of the North Wildwood Coven, which is a part of the Temple of the Spiral Path. So I'm very happy to welcome all of you here and to welcome Brittany.
Hi, thanks for having me here.
It's wonderful to have you. So my first question will be, can you tell us a little bit of how you became involved in astrology, what drew you to it, and what your background in the occult or other things like that was before astrology, or if it was the same time?
Yeah, what drew me to astrology? I was interested since I was a child. I remember my grandmother gave me my first book on fortune telling, which was like a little book that was elementary enough for me to understand that was like about palm reading and astrology and tarot and all kinds of fortune telling, and I was obsessed with it. But I also remember the look that my mom gave my grandmother when she gave me that book. It wasn't technically allowed. So I kind of undercover studied astrology or studied it lightly throughout my childhood, but never really got to the point where I understood that there was a whole chart that could be read actually until I was in my 20s in graduate school. And then it was during a Venus retrograde in Gemini that was kind of revealed to me, and I just became obsessed with it, studied it for 4 years from there. So as far as the occult part of the question, I did discover Wicca when I was about 14 or 15 in 1999. But again, that was it was underground for a long time for me. So I didn't quite, actually coming to professionalism with astrology for me had to do also with coming out as a witch. Those two things were kind of paired because I studied astrology secretly for 4 years, secretly and obsessively, until I started to meet other astrologers and read charts with them. And they were like, you could actually do this. And started to get invitations to do readings and started reading friends' charts. And then in 2016, I launched Rebel Astrology, which was what it was called at the time. Now I call myself the Rebel Coach because I coach as well. But for me, astrology and witchcraft were very linked in that they were parts of my life that were secret for a long time.
And what were you, I'm just curious, when you started to study when you were in college, what were you studying in college? So what was the other part of your life going on at that point that you were focusing on?
Yeah, it wasn't until grad school that I really discovered the deeper level of astrology. But in college, I studied English and anthropology, and then I went to get a master's of fine arts in creative writing. So I was writing at the time. And I do think that astrology as a language and a kind of poetry and a way of storytelling is really significant to me. So I try to find ways to blend those things. I always loved mythology, and especially Greco-Roman mythology as well.
Yeah, and that storyteller's art very much is a part of the readings and being able to interpret in a clear way for people. So in terms of I know that there are so many schools of astrology, and for people here, some people may be very familiar with the many schools of astrology, some may not. Can you kind of talk to us a little bit about what school of astrology you are trained in, and maybe a little bit about a couple of the others and what the differences are so that people can get a sense?
Yeah, for me, what I kind of fell into was evolutionary astrology. For some reason, that's what I discovered. first and really loved. And evolutionary astrology is based on psychological astrology, where the planets are kind of indicating something about the psychology or personality of the people. And it's very much about the person who has the natal chart, the native's life, and their reactions or choices and things. But evolutionary astrology has another layer to it where you're really looking at the chart in terms of personal growth in this lifetime and looking at it throughout different lifetimes. So essentially looking at the chart as a representation of the soul and the soul's growth through many cosmic layers. That is a specific type of astrology. I find that it works well with coaching because it's very focused on growth for one thing, and it also has a lot of room for free will, which I'm sure we'll get to. But it's important because a coach is a partner in helping people flourish. And in order to flourish, you need to be able to make choices and decisions that are best for you. So that is what I use. There are many other branches and schools of astrology. Evolutionary is like what we would probably classify as what we would definitely classify as modern astrology. There are other types of astrology that are more concerned with preserving traditions. There's Renaissance astrology, there's Hellenistic astrology, there's Vedic astrology, which has a long and rich history. And psychological and evolutionary astrology sort of came out of at the same time that people were doing psychology, and that was new and different. And people were going into therapy and focusing on personal growth. I find that blending some traditional techniques in for prediction works really well, but using that framework of talking to the person as a soul who's growing through lifetimes works really well for talking to people about their lives and their charts and framing it in a way that people can understand and actually do something with.
And so that ties in then to, how you kind of added, how should I say, how you added your coaching onto what you do professionally. And that's that. So what was the journey into doing that, and how do you see those two kind of interlinking?
Yeah, I would say that coaching really came about through first my teaching experience. I was teaching before grad school and then during grad school, and I always thought that I would be a teacher. It just didn't turn out to be the choice I made at the end of my education. So I've always really liked working one-on-one with people and listening to them and counseling them through things. When I hired my own coach, it was for my business, really. I thought that hiring a coach would help me grow my business, which it definitely did, and help me define what I wanted. But it also introduced me to coaching in a way where sometimes I just had to be hit over the head with a 2x4, I guess, because all of the books I loved were by coaches, but I'd never heard of this profession, and I didn't really link it together until I hired a coach of my own. And then I was like, oh, this is perfect for me. This is listening to people and helping them. The other reason I chose to add it with astrology was because I was seeing clients already, but I was seeing them maybe like once every 6 months or once a year. And so I was seeing what they were working through, the Pluto transits, the Saturn transits, but not like during the transit itself. And I wanted a way to work with people so that they could actually use these transits to better their lives. And develop a better understanding of themselves. And so when I work with coaching clients, we do integrate astrology into the practice. And it's really about their goals and purpose during that time period as they create this sort of the life that they want. And I support them in doing that and support them in understanding astrology as they do that.
So I guess we're kind of getting to a question I wanted to ask later, but really what we're talking about ties very neatly into it, which is then if you are, I really like how you think of, the coaching and the astrology obviously as very connected because they have to be. But at the same time, I think that brings us back to the question of really, what is the interplay between how astrology and that divinatory system works and how much is up to fate and how much is up to free will, and how do you see the system really interplaying in people's lives?
Yeah, it's a good question. How much do we get to control?
But
I think my answer to most questions like that is kind of both and. There are things that happen that we can't control. There are things in our natal chart that we already can't control. Certainly, like 2020, which we'll get to, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, what's happening in the world, I don't have control over that. I only really have control over how I react to it and what I choose to do given the changes that are occurring. And I think that that is kind of how astrology works for people. You can sort of point at a transit and say, there, on that date, like something of this nature could happen. But there are really different ways that it could go depending on what's already in the person's life, what's already happening, what kind of choices they're willing to make for themselves, how aware they are of what's going to happen. And to some degree, it's really a matter of mindset, I think. And that's where the coaching comes in, is having the mindset to see the transit coming, to know that you can't necessarily control it, but that you can control what you do about it.
Absolutely. And I think that will probably come up when we are talking, like you said, about 2020 and a little bit about 2021 in a little bit. Before we get there, which I think we're going to spend a lot of time talking about what's coming, where we are and what's coming, because I'm sure a lot of people aren't we all so interested in that right now? But the one thing I wanted to just touch on a little bit about when you are looking at a chart, when you look at someone's natal chart for the first time, what are the big signposts that you as an astrologer look to first? Because some people that are on the call, that are listening, may be very experienced and absolutely know their charts backwards and forwards. Other people might be kind of new. So if you're guiding someone to what to look to, what are the biggest signposts that you look at first?
I mean, for me personally, my process when I get a chart from a new client is to cast the chart, print it out, and just kind of gaze at it for divination purposes, and see what jumps out at me first. That's the first thing that I do. I may strip it back to look at what is the closest aspect between two planets here. Certainly, the sort of automatic thing to look for any beginner or any astrologer is, where is the sun located? What sign is it in? Where's the moon located? So for me, that chart gazing is kind of my first part of the process. Then I would start to look more in depth at everything else that's going on in the chart. What are the different techniques that I might use? What perfection year are they in? What progressions are going on as well? How do the transits interact with their chart? There's a lot of different techniques that astrologers can use, asteroids and fixed stars, depending on where they are. I like to use them only when they're super relevant to somebody's chart. But if I was talking to a beginner and saying, this is how you look at a chart, I would tell them, look where the rising sign is, what was on the horizon at the time this person was born, because that kind of sets up the entire chart and it's an important angle. Look at the sun sign, of course, and the house position of the sun, anything that's around it. Look at the moon sign and the house position of the moon. What is it aspecting? And start to get into the chart that way through the person's three key elements.
Yeah, and I noticed, so I've talked to a few astrologers that recommend people, really know their sun sign and identify a lot in our modern culture by our sun sign, but the ascendant, the rising sign is really important. And you recommend that people, when they read your horoscopes, for the week or whatever, look more at the ascendant. Why is that? Why do you recommend that? What about that reflects so much on a person? What is the difference really in your view?
In my view, the reason that horoscopes work best when reading them for the ascendant, first of all, is because astrologers structure them that way. So we are writing horoscopes for your rising sign, which is something a lot of people don't know. And so you can start to see more personal, it starts to get more personal. The predictions become more accurately about certain topics of your life, usually, when you're reading it for your rising sign. The other reason the rising sign is important is because it is you. It's long been sort of talked about as like a mask that you wear or just a first impression. It is a first impression, but it's also part of you. It represents your body. It represents how you interact with the world. It represents how you show up. Your chart ruler is associated, the ruler of your ascendant rules your entire chart. And so the sun sign is still also you. Everything in a natal chart is you. But the sun sign tends to be more of a life. It's like your life force. It's kind of a mission that you're completing. Just as the moon sign is kind of about your habits and needs and emotions, the sun sign is about how you shine, where you show up, where your vitality is to some extent. But your rising sign is the doorway, the entryway to your chart. It is really a really important part of your chart. And I think the more people who understand that they can identify with their rising sign and start reading horoscopes for it, the easier it will be to get out of that mindset that you're a Libra or an Aries or a Sagittarius, when all of us have all 12 signs in our chart, and many of us have other signs emphasized that are not our sun sign.
Yeah, and I that actually kind of ties into a question that I had. It's a bigger topic, but you're kind of touching on it right there, which is that I think the modern, it's wonderful that astrology has been kind of popular for a very long time, even well, basically, as you were saying, since, well, psychology and things, it's been at least 30, 40 years. Oh, and by the way, for everyone who's tuning in, who's not listening to the podcast, you are now seeing one of my cats, Jasper, who has decided to join us for this conversation. So another podcast host. No, but as part of the popularity that has been growing for the last 40 years, part of that popularity has unfortunately kind of allowed or emphasized a sort of watered down version of astrology, where it is just like, oh, I'm an Aries, or I'm a Gemini, or whatever. But now astrology seems to be becoming more mainstream, and I think I've noticed the conversations around it deepening, and people's understanding, even in more mainstream, is gotten beyond just the sun sign aspect. Have you found that kind of to be true, or do you see it differently?
Yeah, I mean, my experience is colored by knowing other astrologers and just astrology fans, but I do notice, like on social media, more people being able to say their sun, moon, and rising, or people I just meet who find out that I'm an astrologer can already tell me their sun, moon, and rising. So it is becoming a more common part of the popular lexicon, which is great because it starts to show people that they have a whole chart and that there's more going on than just the 12 zodiac signs.
Yes. Okay. We could go on and talk about all sorts of other fun chart things, but I think that people probably want to hear some of your thoughts on 2020. Do you want to just dive in? I have tons of questions that I could direct it, but I feel like I just want to also hand it over to you and let you kind of talk a little bit first.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's funny because I was writing the literary horoscopes for Penguin Random House last year, and that's one like kind of pop astrology thing I do where there's 3 paragraphs of forecast and then like a paragraph for each sign and then books for your year. It's just supposed to be fun. But I had to write about 2020 that year, so the forecast wasn't very fun. And my editor, who I've been working with for a while, got back to me and was like, "Can you lighten this up, like in any way?" And I'm like, This is what the astrology is. This is what's happening. So I did try to kind of lighten the tone a little bit, but without changing the actual predictions, which are, this is a year for old structures to crumble and for new ideas to take their place. And I urged people in that very short, very poppy forecast to just be aware that the future is something that they create something that you create, and we're depending on people to create good futures out of all of these endings. But 2020 is definitely a pivotal year. It always was going to be a year when we transitioned, as I'll talk about, from earth to air, and a year when, old era structures are no longer working for us. So that's kind of the tone that I came into the year with. And I was trying really hard. I was also at dinner with a bunch of other astrologers, and we were all talking about having to write about 2020 and like finding it so difficult to not be like a doomsday prophet. Because I never want to scare people as an astrologer. I don't find that puts them in the right mindset to be able to do anything about the transits that are happening. And so I was trying to walk this line between being accurate at predicting things and making sure that people still had some hope for their lives so that they could do something with it. Like, it's going to be hard, it's going to be slow, but you can build something here.
We can all get through it.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're all getting through it. Now that we're here in June, I can, I've been able to speak more frankly about the transits because I think everyone gets it. That 2020 is not like an easy year by any means. Although it does have some gifts that can be offered. They just might be a little harder to find than they are, like in 2019 when Jupiter was in Sagittarius. So we started with the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that became exact on January 12th. And this was building throughout 2019 as they got closer and closer together. And we also had an eclipse on January 10th, very close to that conjunction. But that is a configuration that mundane astrologer Richard Tarnas drew connections between major events that sort of crumble old structures and Saturn-Pluto making challenging alignments with each other. So the last one was September 11th. So astrologers knew that something big was going to happen when Saturn and Pluto aligned, and that it would probably affect the world, affect nations, like that kind of collective large transit. But I'm not a mundane astrologer. That is another branch that has to do with world events and history, where the people who do it well have studied history very thoroughly. But I can say that from reading Richard Tarnas that this was going to be a major alignment. So coronavirus happened. We also have Jupiter and Pluto making conjunctions in the sign of Capricorn. The sign of Capricorn is all about governments and economies and laws and nations and big, serious structures, which for the most part in our world are kind of terrestrial structures. Like they operate we think of nations as territories and land, the government is based in Washington, D.C. Economies are banks and brick and mortar structures, not necessarily cyber, like Bitcoin or something like that could become more popular when we enter a more Aquarian period. So Jupiter and Pluto conjunction in Capricorn. Pluto is the lord of the underworld, wealth, death. Jupiter is, king of heaven, the upper air, the upper realms. So it's two kings coming together. On my personal notes for that conjunction in 2019, when I was thinking about 2020, Saturn and Pluto conjunction, I was thinking this is the death of an old reality. Welcome to the new reality. Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, I was thinking, a powerful king rises from the dead or the underworld, which could be coronavirus, perhaps. Some people have made links to Jupiter and Pluto and pandemics. I wasn't thinking that way necessarily at the time, but I was seeing the ghost of capitalism. I was seeing expansions of power in Pluto. So I was thinking about Jupiter and Pluto as this powerful conjunction that really either it expands powers that already are, or it crumbles structures that are no longer as powerful as they once seemed. We had that first one on April 4th. We have another one coming up tomorrow. So it's in alignment. The last one for the year will be November 12th. So we've got that all year long. That's a whole 2020 thing. So the story hasn't ended yet. It hasn't played out all the way yet. But we are seeing uses and abuses of power. We are seeing very powerful sort of things play out on the world stage, and they are affecting us. We had Venus retrograde in Gemini from May 13th through June 25th. So we were feeling those restrictions on our relationships. We were communicating with people in a Gemini sort of way through chat and text and social media and Zoom, because it was the only way we could communicate. People had feelings about it. People started to return to their normal activities during that period, or fight to return to their normal activities. Venus is still in her shadow of that retrograde. She's stationed direct on June 25th, but it will be July 29th before she gets back to the original, to the degree where she finishes that retrograde. So it's still kind of in play. We're still digesting what we learned while Venus was in Gemini. And then Saturn went into Aquarius March 21st, and we'll go back into Capricorn July 1st. So that was really the period, Saturn in Aquarius, when people in the United States, at least in New York, started to feel that coronavirus was actually affecting them. You know, we had lockdowns. That's when people went inside. That's when people started to talk about coronavirus more over here, even though it was already happening in the world. And Saturn in Aquarius is going to happen at the end of the year, and will be a trend for a couple of years. So we've got restrictions on freedom as a possible theme, right? Airborne diseases, possibly high-tech ways of networking and communicating. But also when I think of Saturn Aquarius, I think of surveillance economies, like tightening up restrictions on communities, architecting information in certain ways. Because Saturn rules both Capricorn and Aquarius, we're in a very Saturnine period, and Saturn is all about authority. Saturn is all about hard work, restrictions, in some of the best ways, moral value, building character, focusing on what matters, stripping things back. But like many things in astrology, it can work in different ways. So Saturn can work on your behalf to help you accomplish something that was hard won, but well rewarded. And Saturn can work on behalf of those in authority to help them maintain authority. So I want to look at it both ways when we're talking about 2020, because of the things that are happening and the way people are reacting to them. And because I think it's so important that we step in to create our own future, that we decide how things are going to go. Because it's not necessarily a given that just because, our extended Capricorn season ends, that Aquarius is better. I have clients asking me, will next year be better? And I'm like, well, it will be different. But I cannot hardly ever predict that any year will be better than the last year, because it's such a value judgment. And it really depends on the person asking the question and how things are going for them. But it also depends on the way that we approach things. Yeah. So knowing where we've been in 2020, that a lot of that is still happening or coming back around, because we live in cycles, and these are major cycles that we're living through. Mars is in Aries now. He went into that sign, which is the sign that he rules, June 27th. And he will be there through January 6th. So let's talk a little bit about Mars and Aries, because it's such a key part of the second half of 2020.
I will just put in there that I have so much martial energy in my chart. So you already know that I'm like, well, I think Mars and Aries is good. I know that he's a malefic, and there's all sorts of problems and potential world problems because of it. But I like Mars. So anyway.
Agree for Mars. Yeah, I mean,
yes.
let's talk about the good parts of Mars, because there are good parts. And the determination of a malefic or a benefic can be confusing for people, and it can also sort of create this binary situation that isn't really true. You know, yeah, Mars gets involved in a lot of like dirty pranks. Like let's be honest, in astrology, especially in 2020, I'm not really expecting him to be super benefic.
No, no, I don't.
Months, yeah. But Mars is also what makes you go. It's vitality, it's drive, it's desire. We need it. We need that driving force. You know, and I think originally we associate Mars so much with masculinity in our culture, and Venus so much with femininity. So when I use those words, I'm just applying them to the way we normally speak about them. But everyone has Mars, everyone has Venus in their chart. But masculinity originally, with Mars would have been vitality. It would have been associated with, you know, Aries is the first sign, it's the spring equinox, it's growing season, it's the beginning of things, it's the start, associated with defending and protecting, you know, in noble ways. Mars desire in a good sense, as something that drives people, as something that motivates people, as motivation. There's a lot of good sides to Mars, and I think one of the reasons that we talk about him so much as a malefic now is partly because of the toxic ways that we relate to masculinity in our culture. Because that, I think that the way that we relate to a planet collectively or personally can have a lot to do with the outcome of what happens. So the way we do Mars now is Mars on hyperdrive, Mars as toxic masculinity, Mars is attacking rather than necessarily defending. Mars is hyper competitiveness that gets toxic with other people. So when Mars gets into the sign that he rules in Aries, it's very, very fiery for us because we already have that relationship with Mars. And Mars, by the way, retrogrades every 18 months or so, but hasn't retrograded in Aries since 1988. So this is a little less common. In 1988, he wasn't making the same kind of aspects that he's making now to larger outer planets. So this is a little more volatile of a Mars retrograde season. And he'll be in Aries for 6 months because of that retrograde that he's going into. So we have this Mars energy is like, you know, you think of protests. There are lots of fireworks going on around me in Brooklyn right now. People just lighting off explosion. They're feeling frustrated. They can't go anywhere, or they're being told not to. You know, there are abuses of power that are being fought, Mars and Aries. It can have really good connotations for that kind of like drive and desire and activism for a better future. But also in this situation, I think is likely to be very disruptive and potentially violent during election season for us. So Mars is already in Aries, and he'll enter the retrograde shadow on July 25th. And during this period, while he's in Aries, he will be squaring Saturn, will be back in Capricorn, Pluto, and Jupiter in Capricorn. All the planets that we just talked about that were contributing to this like crumbling of old structures, this power struggle, this question about the uses and abuses of power, governments, economies, the law, right? All of those things. Mars in Aries is making a challenging aspect to those planets throughout this late summer and fall. And so we can expect to see challenges to government, challenges to authority, challenges to power, challenges to the way we do money and economies in Capricorn. And Mars will also, I'd just like to point out, be conjunct the asteroid Chiron, who is in Aries right now, and Chiron being the healer, the wounded healer in Aries. I wrote about that when he entered that sign. I believe it was in 2018. on my blog. And I was thinking of it as kind of healing the wounds of toxic masculinity and looking back at the 70s and all of the anti-war protests against Vietnam, also healing or attempting to heal some of the wounds of war. But where we're healing, we can also reopen a wound. So again, this is Mars and Chiron together in Aries does not strike me as a particularly, it strikes me as a painful aspect where we're really going to feel those uses and abuses of power as we've seen them. It may motivate people to fight against them, which can be a good thing. But I would say that in general, if you're listening to this forecast and you want an idea of what to do with this energy, be careful, because Mars in Aries can be impulsive. It can want to be first and fast and furious, on a good day. So, there's a lot of like act first, think later kind of energy to this transit. And so I would say, think about what you desire and what's the best way to get it. Where are you motivated to act? Where are you motivated to fight? Is it for a just cause? Is it going to serve you well? Is there a better way to do it?
Because we don't also have the help, so much help from Jupiter right now, because Jupiter is in Capricorn, where he does not like to be, correct?
Yeah, right. Jupiter is in his fall in Capricorn, which puts him in a position of less power than Saturn and Pluto. So he's not really able to give you all of the protection and blessings that he would in Sagittarius or Pisces, signs that he rules, or Cancer, the sign of his exaltation. So you don't have that. Jupiter in Capricorn is very much more the magistrate, the one who is signing things into law rather than helping you get out of anything. So the judge, the teacher, the lawyer can be very like ethical and morally upright, which is helpful. But Jupiter, normally being the planet of expansiveness and luck, like can't act that way exactly in Capricorn. He has too much responsibility to be doing that.
Yes. Yeah. So I think that we have a number of retrogrades coming up, which I've heard a lot of people talking about. And I know that while retrogrades are concerning, I feel like this is kind of it's not necessarily about 2020, but I feel like I know that retrogrades are important, but I feel like sometimes there's too much emphasis placed on them, or people think of them as just naturally horrendous and just a really terrible, malefic. When, like you were saying, it's kind of like Venus in this sense, when she was in retrograde, it's yes, it's a challenge, most definitely. She's going through the underworld, but it is not, it's a necessary part of the journey, if you know what I mean. Can you talk a little bit about how you view retrogrades and how you interact with them? Because, I mean, for example, another thing I think that is more pop now is everyone talks about Mercury retrogrades. And, oh my God, well, my computer won't work because it's Mercury retrograde. And I feel like that's sometimes a little bit overkill, at least to me, it seems.
Yeah, I think it's funny as astrology becomes, it's always been popular, but as it hits this wave of popularity, it's interesting to see what comes up. And the two things I see that are most talked about among people who are not astrologers tend to be retrogrades and eclipses, which are just two small pieces of astrology. So it's just interesting to see which little pieces stick in people's minds and which get the most hype. Because I think retrogrades are just time being circular, honestly. I think time is not linear. Time is circular. The past comes back around. You have periods of rest. And that's what a retrograde is. There is more to it. And certainly if you're experiencing it in your natal chart, which I think we'll talk about, like there might be more to it for you in particular. But in general, retrogrades are happening all the time, especially the outer planet ones. There's been a lot of posts I've seen that are like 6 planets are retrograde at the same time. And it's like, that's not new. It's a lot right now, but it's the outer planets go retrograde for months every year. Mercury is retrograde 3 or 4 times a year. Venus and Mars every 18 months. So that's just your life, and I think I can talk more about separating signal from noise, but Right. Mars going retrograde in Aries, it matters because in 2020 there are bigger things happening and Mars aspects those bigger things. That is why it matters. But Mars will go retrograde again 18 months from this one. Like it's not such a rare event, but the way it's aligning with some of the more rare events makes it more significant than perhaps usually it would be.
Yeah, which is, I think, then why everyone is going, oh, is it because all 6 planets are retrograde? Because clearly things are not great with the space weather in general. So it's a way to sort of relate to it that you can see and say, well, maybe it's because of that. When what you're saying is that it's obviously it's a much deeper picture of which retrogrades are aspecting with other things that are not so favorable. And then that's obviously happening at the same time as retrogrades, but retrogrades happen a lot. They happen all the time. So
yeah, it's, that's why astrology is more complex than people necessarily give it credit for, because there are so many different things going on all at the same time. It's very much like an orchestra playing a piece of music. You wouldn't necessarily pick out the one section and only focus on them, or the one violinist. You would be listening to the whole piece of music, and maybe analyzing it based on the different themes that are happening throughout that piece of music. But to actually learn astrology is to learn how the whole orchestra plays together. So yeah, people are trying to relate to it, and I absolutely understand, but retrogrades by themselves are nothing to freak out about. It's just the way time has not progressed in a linear fashion. We don't always get to be productive and, climbing to higher and higher heights. I know it's such a problem for Americans in particular. This idea that things aren't just getting better and better and better and better.
All the time. What?
Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to ask the question. It hits on the other thing that you mentioned, which is eclipses. Can you talk to us a little bit about eclipses? Because we had one on the summer solstice, which is not very rare, obviously. But can you talk about what's happening with the eclipses this year, what we've already had, and what's upcoming?
Yeah, there is one coming up very soon on July 5th. It is Independence Day, which I think it's significant primarily because of the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. So again, you have slower moving planets doing something that is really significant, but then you have an eclipse on top of it, just kind of highlighting that this is happening. So that's what makes that eclipse significant. And we've been having them in Cancer and Capricorn. And because we've been having such a heavy Capricorn emphasis for the last 3 years since Saturn entered Capricorn in 2017, they've been pretty intense. And that's because of the outer planets that are in that sign mostly. But Cancer Capricorn, you have an axis that is all about the balance between nurturing and responsibility, the balance between caring and emotions and getting things done, the balance between feelings and actions, or doing things because you think they're right, or because it's the law, or because it's the rule, versus how you feel about it. So then you have this eclipse in Capricorn happening July 5th, which is Independence Day in the US. I think that it will probably highlight some of those uses and abuses of power that we talked about earlier in the forecast. I think it will really highlight the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction, and how that is bringing up all of the ghosts of our past and all of our issues with infrastructure and all of our issues with the law and the way that we interpret it, the way that we enforce it. And so that probably will be a big one. And then we have some more in November and December. We start to get on the Gemini and Sagittarius axis. And that has more to do with, less to do with how we feel, more to do with how we say and what we know. Kind of an axis of truth and knowledge, I would say. And so November 30th, we have an eclipse in Gemini, a lunar eclipse, and then December 14th, we have a total solar eclipse in Sagittarius. which may feel more significant to that. And there are some other outer planet things happening at that time, with Jupiter and Saturn going into Aquarius and making a conjunction. So the eclipses this year have played out around outer planet activity, which is making them maybe feel more intense than eclipses necessarily do all the time. Again, we had an eclipse when Saturn and Pluto were conjunct, January 10th through 12th. So that was a happy new year, our entry into 2020. And we're exiting 2020 with just as much intensity.
Oh, so fun.
Oh, yeah.
All astrologers have been having such a joyful year.
I think I told somebody I think it's making me a better astrologer, because I have to give predictions. I have to just say it like it is now. And not that I didn't before, but it's it's much more of a year that you have to just deadpan tell people about how it's going to be. But as far as like opportunities for using eclipses and retrogrades, like in the mindset that you might have, Mars retrograde September 9th through November 13th, it will probably be, it's a frustration of vitality, right? Any kind of retrograde is sort of reverse, and to some extent frustrates the way that planet would like to act in its best of days. So Mars in Aries sort of being held back from being vital, from reaching their desires, from going after their motivation. Certainly there's a lot of like anger management stuff that comes up with a Mars in Aries retrograde, because if anger is frustrated or pushed down or not allowed to come out in a healthy way, then it comes out in a dysfunctional way. It's also election season. I would say if you want to know how to use it, like, be careful. It could be violent and a little bit dysfunctional. So this is a heavy election season. And in order to maintain your own self-care and your own well-being, be aware that that's going to be happening. Limit your news intake, like limit what you take in about it. Surround yourself with people who are supportive if you can, or even if it's virtual, and we'll probably have to go. I anticipate more lockdowns.
Yeah.
So, choose wisely with where your energy is directed.
That's true in the best of times, but certainly right now when all of this energy is coming up, that
it's retrograde.
Energy, which the frustration and anger levels can get higher. So what you are intaking, what you're bringing in, will be very important for how you can process through that.
Right. Like protect. We use the Mars protection energy to allow your boundaries to maintain. Saturn is really all about boundaries, but Mars is a protector and defender too. So protect yourself from just being way too involved in that fire energy. Unless you're the kind of person who's all about leading and fighting and then you may find that it is exactly where you want to be. But certainly not without risk.
Well, Mars was also the god of agriculture. So I think there's also that, like, there are productive ways that energy can be, used as for the land, as for what you are growing, but it has a very martial character. So you're saying, we need to all be very careful with it.
You could find you get a lot done on the land, and, preparing agriculture, harvesting food, sure.
So speaking of how all these things, because I want to talk a little bit about 2021. Why don't we just talk a little bit about what happens, in the first few months, if there's some things that you want to bring up there, and then we can talk a little bit about how you might suggest that people, if there are ways that people can look at their charts and how some of these things might be more personally applicable, even though they are on these larger levels applicable to all of us. But let's talk a little bit about 2021 first. If there's anything I don't want to be that person saying, does it get better? But
no, but we all are that person. Yeah. Things leave Capricorn, so there's that. I think in some ways it may feel better. It may feel less heavy than 2020. In order to talk about 2021, I have to talk about the movement of Saturn and Jupiter into Aquarius at the end of 2020. So Saturn and Jupiter move into Aquarius December, let's see, I'm losing my place. December 17th is Saturn, December 19th is Jupiter, and then they make what is called the Great Conjunction, December 21st at the winter solstice. That is a very big event that like closes out 2020 with a real shebang. So we have, this happens every 20 years that Saturn and Jupiter conjoin, but it happens in a triplicity of different elemental signs every 200 years. So for the last 200 years or so, we've had Saturn and Jupiter making great conjunctions in earth signs. Aquarius will be the first one that is in an air sign, leading us into a 200-year cycle of air as opposed to earth. And air, you know, hopefully we can get a breath of fresh air when Saturn and Jupiter enter Aquarius, but it certainly, it begins an era, not just a year. So 2020 was the beginning of a decade, but it was also the end of so many things. 2021 is the beginning of a 200-year cycle of air. And we're looking at how we can architect and restructure our communities, what it means to be humanitarian, what it means to have a society. Jupiter is the meaning, Saturn is the architect. And so we start 2021 with this new cycle that we're beginning. We also have Uranus and Taurus showing up a little more in 2021. Uranus has been in Taurus since 2018. And that planet is an outer planet. It's very disruptive in whatever sign it's in, whatever aspects it's making. It's all about change and volatility, innovation, new ways of thinking. In Taurus especially, it can align with, unfortunately, dictators and fascism. So Taurus is a sign that does not like to change. It wants tradition, it wants stability, it wants things to stay the same. Uranus is volatile and disruptive. So you get disruptive people who want to make things sort of either stay the same in their mind or go back to the way it was in their mind. But you also, I wrote about Uranus and Taurus on my blog and talked about ways that you can envision that cycle to be different because it is a 7-year transit. So this is a long one through 2026. Uranus and Taurus has something to do with rewilding things, going back to, you know, innovations that are actually old ways, like growing real food or biomimicry, everything green, all kinds of green technology, right? It could be Uranus and Taurus. It could be revolutionizing pleasure, like going back to a sense of how can we be a community where we get to experience more pleasure, where we don't have to work all of the time, where there's room for our pleasure in our lives. So there are different ways to look at Uranus and Taurus and think about, what are you rewilding? Where do you want to experience pleasure? How do you want prosperity to operate in your life? It's another sort of Uranus and Taurus question around big changes that you can make to Taurian themes. Now, the reason Uranus and Taurus comes up is because Saturn from Aquarius will be squaring Uranus throughout 2021. So you have Saturn, the planet of rules and boundaries, restrictions, hard work, in the sign Aquarius of communities and society. Really, Saturn rules Aquarius, but Saturn there can be a humanitarian architect, an architect for society, however you might envision it. This is us creating what will the future look like for the collective. When it is squaring, it's making challenging aspects to the restrictions that, you know, our rising sort of dictator geographic world landscape is bringing up. It's challenging that, right? We don't want the future to be like that. It's also perhaps Saturn as a restriction in the sign of air may keep us going through this phase. Like, it may not necessarily end in 2020, that the pandemic is necessarily over, or that fear of illness and concern about spreading illness is necessarily over. So there's a real tension between restriction and freedom here. However, whatever side you might be on it, or however you might feel about it, we have to be able to create freedoms from restriction, or break free of restriction to create freedoms for ourselves. So that's a big theme coming up in 2020. Jupiter in Aquarius certainly can operate better than he does in Capricorn. Jupiter in Aquarius can be very innovative, very interested in going outside the norm and bringing ideas back. Jupiter also will spend some time in Pisces in 2021, which is a sign he rules, and that's great, because that's a sign where Jupiter can bring abundance and luck and dreams and visions and help with things. And yes, help Jupiter. And Pisces can be a very peaceful sign, also the sign of the fish, the sign of abundance from the oceans. May 13th through July 28th of 2021, we'll have that. The Jupiter in Aquarius is not bad. It's really an interesting transit. And I think that with Saturn and Jupiter both there, it will be intriguing to see what we can come up with as a collective for the future that we want.
Yeah. Certainly how they are placed right now. So will be different, and hopefully will bring some new innovation, since it's now moving into air. But
yeah, I think it can. Again, it has a lot to do with how we decide to interact with our society and what choices we're making around that. So that is what I hope for. Innovations that are good for people and help us go back to some of the better things about being part of the earth. Go back to growing real food, local commerce, things that seem innovative now, but used to be just normal.
Yeah, which is a return in some sense. So that also makes sense with the other aspects. So one of the things I wanted to touch on, well, before we do that, there was actually a question in the Q&A. So I will just click on this to answer. So is there a historical reference where what is happening now has happened before? What can we learn and apply to today? So kind of, are there other I mean, as you said, you're not a mundane astrologer. Those are the people that study kind of the history from that astrological perspective, but
are there precedents? There are no direct precedents for 2020. It is what we're living through. Yeah. But you can pull out certain aspects and say, oh, Saturn and Pluto, if you read those chapters from Richard Tarnas's book, Cosmos and Psyche, you can see how the different Saturn-Pluto aspects played into World War I, World War II, September 11th, major world events, where structures really did crumble and then had to be rebuilt, right? Both world wars really made people rethink their societal structures and the way they wanted to live. And then we got the UN and all of these different ways of being globally. I think that coronavirus could be similar in that we have different ways of aligning our nations globally after this event. Jupiter and Pluto, I've seen people talk about it with pandemics. I've seen people talk about it as something to do with plutocrats and wealth. And that's what I'm really relating to is the sense of expansions of power or abuses of power and the pushback to that. You can look through time and see different Jupiter and Pluto conjunctions. I don't have that information with me, but you can see it playing out in different ways through history when they were conjoined at different times. So you can look at the different pieces of 2020 and the different puzzle pieces and see precedents and start to make connections. But 2020 as a whole, the whole orchestral theme of it is its own thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting, unique sound. Oh, God. Anyway.
We don't need to compose that piece. I don't know what it sounds like.
Composed right now. So,
yeah.
All right, positive. Thinking positive.
Yes.
Yeah, but I wanted to kind of pivot a little bit towards Looking at it, if you are as an astrologer looking at someone's chart and someone comes to you and says, okay, well, Mars in Aries has these issues that we've, of course, gone into in quite a lot of depth. As an astrologer, when you look at someone's natal chart, what do you look at in their chart for how it would personally impact them?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So to kind of separate signal from noise when you're reading forecasts, the first thing I would look at in somebody's chart, or if they're looking at their own chart, is this a big collective transit? If it is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction or the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn, or if it is the Saturn and Jupiter conjunction in Aquarius, even if you don't have anything in those signs in your chart, if you're not Capricorn or Aquarius rising, if you don't have any planets there, you can bet that they'll affect you because they're collective transits. So you can look at the house of your chart where it falls to see, how is this likely to affect my life? The seventh house, for example, being the house of one-on-one partnerships, relationships, and sometimes open enemies. So if you're looking at your seventh house in Capricorn, you're looking at these different transits playing out, and it's about power in your relationships or power struggles in your relationships, or just being aware of who opposes you and who is with you. Could be one way to interpret a seventh house transit. So if it's a big collective thing, look at the house it's transiting through first. Slower moving planets in general, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. When they move slower, the transit takes longer for someone's chart, so you're likely to feel it more if it's coming for you. So if you are a Capricorn, at some point since 2008, you've had Pluto cross your sun, or you're about to, or you're experiencing it now. That is a big transit. That's signal separated out from all of the noise of the different kinds of astrology things that you might be reading. So look for slower moving planets, look for collective transits. Look at your chart ruler. You know, if you have Aries rising or Scorpio rising, your chart ruler is Mars. If you have Taurus or Libra rising, your chart ruler is Venus. Pay attention to what that planet is doing, because as it moves around throughout the zodiac, it may affect your chart more significantly than other people may feel a Venus or Mars transit, or a Saturn transit if you're Capricorn or Aquarius rising. I also always look for things crossing the angles. The angles of a chart are the 4 points of your chart that are the most sensitive. So it starts with the ascendant, which we talked about at the beginning of this talk, your rising sign. Across from your rising sign, you have the descendant, so the same degree of the opposite sign. You can imagine there's a line flowing through there. Ascendant, first house is you, your body, the way you relate to the world, the way you show up. Descendant, seventh house, is others, other people, who you partner with, what you're attracted to in other people, who you don't get along with, right? But this is all about relationships in the seventh house. Then you have your midheaven, which usually in the chart is signified by an MC, somewhere around the top of your chart, between usually the 9th and 11th houses, depending on the house system you're using. That MC point, that's how you show up in public, what your legacy is, how people know you at large, often what your career is, because that's often how we're known in our particular society. That's a significant point. And then directly across from it, down at the bottom of your chart, you would have the imam coli, the IC. That is the most private part of your chart, where you are, how you are at home, what your family was like, what your past is like, your ancestors, right? Influencing that legacy that you're putting out into the world. So these 4 points, the ascendant and descendant, the midheaven, the imam coli, when things pass over those points, they tend to feel more significant, whether it's an eclipse or a planet moving and then retrograding and then moving back over again. You will feel it more heavily if it's on an angle. So look for things that are going to cross your angles. And then the same with your sun or moon. If a big planet particularly is aspecting your natal sun or moon, let's say I'm a Libra, Pluto's squaring my sun, which has happened, but still happening really. That's a transit of transformation, right? When you get a Pluto square to a personal planet, that is significant because it's slow moving, it takes years, and it's going to really give you a whole death rebirth cycle of who you are. So look at your sun and moon, anything that's happening there. The aspects, the closest aspect, and the one that can make the most difference is a conjunction, something that is directly conjoining the natal planet at the same degree where you had it when you were born will be on a sensitive point in your chart. You can also look at planets that are squaring certain things. Like I just said, Pluto was squaring my sun. Planets that are opposed, trines tend to be a little lighter and nicer and more helpful. The other ones are more challenging, but they force you to grow. And often out of that challenge and tension comes the best result, the best kind of growth. Pluto was squaring my sun, and Uranus was opposing my sun when I decided to start my business as an astrologer. And it took that kind of push and that kind of tension and challenge for me to actually do something like that. So those are the things that I would look for. How big is it? How slow moving is it? Does it aspect my angles or my sun and moon in particular? And then if you are well versed in astrology, you can also look at other natal planets and the aspect that a transit may be making to those. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, that's really excellent. So
yeah.
I think that gives people enough to go on in terms of what they would start looking for. Of course, they should be talking to someone who's professional, such as yourself, because it's like you're saying, it's such a large topic that it's nice to have handholds and to be able to dive in from, but then it's also very helpful to be able to get some swimming lessons while you're going through it. But I think that is a very important point to begin from. When you're looking at some of these things that are challenging that are coming up, what are some of the ways that you advise people outside of, let's say, what we were talking about, limiting your media consumption and being aware that some of this energy is going to be coming into your life? Are there any other remediation techniques? Like, I know that chart remediation and like remediation working with planets is a thing in certain schools of astrology, and I wanted to just kind of get your thoughts on that.
Yeah. When I think of remediation, I'm thinking traditional astrology and very specific techniques that people are practiced in for helping people overcome some of the challenges of their birth chart, usually in kind of a magical way, like buying a gemstone or getting a talisman or something like that. That's not really what I'm not prescriptive in that way because I haven't studied that particular technique. But I think coaching is, I guess you could see it as a modern type of remediation, spoken very loosely and with credit to traditional astrologers.
Traditional astrologers were not like that, but yes, I know.
Yes. Ways that you can deal with transits happening, like things that are happening that you don't especially like. I find that trying to embody and relate to the energy of that planet usually helps with the understanding of that planet. If you feel angry during Mars retrograde, what can you do to release your anger that in a productive and healthy way? Can you go for a run? Can you beat a pillow? Can you not necessarily have to get in a fight with your next door neighbor, right? So there's relating with the planet and allowing what comes up and embracing that emotion for what it is, but finding a way to channel it is one way to deal with it. I think for Mars and Aries in particular, I would say have a project, get motivated with something. You may be involved in protests, and that could be really great for some people, and that could be a really important project and passion for them. And so in that case, if you're that type of person, go for it. If you're not that type of person, don't beat yourself up about it. Don't let anybody else beat you up about it. Just find a project that works for you. Where's the best use of your vitality now? how are you going to rebuild your own life after 2020, especially if it's really crumbled old structures that impacted you in a very personal way? Direct your energy toward that. Direct your energy toward a goal. Mars in Aries loves to compete, loves to be first, loves to try new things, loves new beginnings. So go with that. Challenge this idea of power and control by taking control of your own life and finding ways to make your own life vital and to thrive. I think that so much of it is what choice are you going to make during this transit that is going to work for you, because it's not what Mars in Aries is doing to you. It's just that the weather is hot. People are frustrated, but what are you doing during that time?
That's fantastic and really well spoken. That's excellent. We have a question that I think is very nice as we're coming towards the end. The question is, if you had to choose one or two go-to resources to learn and start diving deeper into astrology, what would you recommend?
My favorite beginner book that I think is so comprehensive is April Elliott Kent's The Practical Guide. I believe it's called The Practical Guide to Astrology, but I think I'm missing some words there. But her name is April Elliott Kent, Kent.
Oh, no, it's definitely for this. We'll talk after.
Yeah. The Essential Guide to Practical Astrology is the title. And that covers, planets, aspects, signs, all of the different components you need to start reading a natal chart. I also am a big fan of Caroline Casey, so I love her book on visionary activist astrology called Making the Gods Work for You. That one includes some kind of like modern planetary magic, which is interesting as well if you're interested in that. Stephen Forrest is one of my favorite astrologers because I am an evolutionary astrologer, and he was one of the first people to kind of start that movement in that school. So any of Stephen Forrest's books, he's been coming out with books on the elements. I believe Earth is the newest one.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So check out his work. He has a book called The Inner Sky that is great for starters. And those are all good starting books to dive in.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I'll put a link to these, the names of these books and everything in the show notes. So if you didn't get a chance, it will be all there. So I think I want to just ask for people who are interested in knowing more about you and finding your work, and where should they go, and what are you up to? I know some of what you're up to, but that's...
You should go to rebelastrology.net. So REBEL astrology, all one word, .net. That's where you'll find all of my astrology and coaching work. And what I'm up to, I actually just stopped seeing clients for a short time because I'm having a baby. So I'm going to take some time off to focus on that. This is our first, so new motherhood. And I will still pop in I'm going to pre-schedule some monthly forecasts starting with July. I normally do weekly horoscopes. So those will be coming back in 2021. And then I'll be reopening my books in 2021 in coaching. But for the second half of the year, I will have some things up in the shop for forecasts that can help you with planning for 2021 and getting ready for it. And I will have some monthly forecasts to help you through the rest of 2020. So you can sign up for my newsletter. My newsletter is the best way to keep in touch and know what I'm doing.
That is very, very excellent. And then when things are getting we have, just for those who are not listening, another cat popped in, Banana McClear. So for those who are wanting to get to actually do a consultation with you, you're going to have to wait until 2021, but then you will get to have that experience again with you, which is wonderful. So I want to thank you, Brittany, for this, and I'm sure we're going to do this again. Hopefully we'll do it in 2021, and it will be slightly more positive. But I know that it's been actually very positive because there's so much that we can do when we're aware. When we have this foreknowledge, it can be a wonderful tool for us to know what's coming a little bit. So thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. This is an awakening year, so it's okay if you're still adjusting to it. It's okay if you're confused. Like, just awaken to what matters to you.
Oh, we are
work on
all awakening, it seems a lot.
that. We're so awakened.
All right. So thank you to everybody who has tuned in live, and thank you to everyone who's listening. So enjoy the rest of the year, and I think it's going to be okay. We're going to get through.
Yes, we definitely will. You know, we're living through history. That's what it is. Thank you so much, Joanna, for having me.
All right. See you guys. Bye.
Bye.
So that was a very excellent chat with Miss Brittany. While it's not fun to talk about 2020, Forewarned is truly forearmed, and I hope that this discussion was as helpful for you as it was for me. Brittany will be back with us at the end of 2020 to look ahead at 2021. In the meantime, I encourage you to check out her work online, which is excellent, and check out the work of Austin Coppock and other great astrologers out there, as they really can help us do our best to plan and help one another during these times. This episode is coming out about 2 weeks after it was recorded live because of my crazy schedule right now. My husband and I are moving. We are raising chickens, planting trees, gardening, and the audio work for it had to wait just a little bit. So my interview with Camellia Elias will also be up in the next few days, talking tarot and fortune telling, and after that, the podcast schedule should go back to something like normal. As always, thank you so much for listening. Thanks to everyone who joined in live and submitted questions via the webinar. As always, we will do that each time via Zoom, so you can check our website and register. Please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts if you enjoy what we're doing here, as it really helps us. You can also check out our website at coffeeanddivination.com. and find me on Twitter, where I am at FiddleAngel. Enjoy your journeys with divination, and we'll see you next time.
How long was the earth there? How long can we say we believe?